Good morning, everyone, and welcome to week 7. You may have noticed that the requirements each week now are becoming a lot lighter. This week, week 7, is particularly light. I think that's in the context of you having to work on your papers. So, like we said the last time we met synchronously and in the message I sent to you last week, week 7 is an easy week. We're looking at the idea of gender, intersectionality, and nonviolent resistance. And when you're looking at this, it requires that you look at 3.1 and 3.2 only, right? So it requires you to read the material on the USIP website for 3.1 and 3.2 only. There's no forum assignment this week. Uh, there's no need to respond to your fellow colleagues. But what you do need to do is read 3.1 and 3.2 and work on your paper. Just a brief synopsis of what's contained. You would need to read it and go over it, but it talks essentially about women and nonviolent struggle. Uh, it makes the point that nonviolent movements succeed in their objectives when they have what the material calls three distinct principles. And it talks about unity, planning, and nonviolent discipline. So that might be worth honing in on and looking at. It also makes the point that half the world is made up of women. So it goes without saying that the participation of women in struggles, particularly nonviolent struggles, is critical. It takes us to a few examples. It talks about Argentina, during the military dictatorship when there were a large number of people who had disappeared. It talks about women coming out each week, protesting, marching, and hoping to be reunited with their children. It talks about examples in Liberia. And we know in history there have been a number of really great women in struggle that have stood out. In the US context, we know the name Rosa Parks. On the African continent, we know the name Lillian Ngoyi, known as the kind of Rosa Parks of Africa. We know of the Great March of 1956, for example, of women in South Africa. So there are a number of key examples in the world where women have played a critical role in struggle. The other point, maybe that's worth looking at, is how women play great roles in struggle, but do become marginalized after the struggle is over, after the revolution is over. And if we look at Asia, Latin America, and perhaps particularly Africa, the post colonial context has seen women being marginalized. But we're also seeing, quite encouragingly, in parts of Africa where there is a serious attempt to rectify this. We know in countries like Rwanda stands out in terms of women representation in parliament. Uh, we know that major political parties in South Africa have what they call 50-50 representation. So half women and half men is what they aim for. So, while women have been marginalized in post revolutionary societies, post colonial societies, in recent times we are seeing a really serious attempt to rectify this. In 3.2, the material focuses largely on intersectionality, and I think that might be a word you've become familiar with. It's a word that has appeared in the academy in recent times, in recent years, and it essentially is about how complex identities are. And you may want to read up in the context of violence and conflict about how identities matter, how issues of age, race, ethnicity, class, religion, ability, and disability all matter. The material also makes the point about how the media shapes views and how we understand the dynamism of gender. We have to remember that in contexts of conflict, often norms around gender that we've become accustomed to are abandoned. And we know that very often the spaces occupied by men tend to expand. There's a really interesting statistic cited in the material where it talks about in the last 60 years, 10 civilians have died for every soldier. And as traumatic and difficult that is to hear, it certainly is not surprising. If one thinks about Iraq, about Afghanistan, about Mozambique, about many other parts of Africa, right? Uh, of course, far more civilians die than soldiers die in these contexts of conflict. So that's it, 3.1 and 3.2. I do hope that you look at the material closely, and then you can dispense on that and focus on your paper. If you've written me an email and I have not as yet responded, I will certainly do that today. All the best for week 7, and I hope you're enjoying the material so far.